Cheers, mate.
Cheers.
Thanks for joining me for a beer.
No, how come you're sitting higher than I am?
I've got a higher stool than you. I think you do look very short over there.
I need to find another one.
He's not really that short. This is Barra Miller, a really good mate of mine. We've been mates for years. And of course, he's well known as one of the world's leading rod designers. I just wanted to start off, though, Ian, by talking about your early days. Can you remember the first fishing rod you ever built?
Oh, I kind of can. I guess I mucked around with old fishing rods and rebuilding guides and stuff like that, as most do. And my first rods were, they would have been dogs of things because they were made from, cheap throwaway bin blanks and stuff like that. But I do remember the first rod I made, which was actually a decent rod. And it was built on an ugly stick blank, of course, a 510 UB. I remember that spin rod, and I built it for bass fishing. And it was really cool. It had hyperlong grips and chrome plated brass reel seat, like a whole bunch of stuff you wouldn't put on a bass rod these days. But I would have been in the mid-teens, I suppose.
Was that the start of a passion? Did you build a lot of rods after that, or?
I did. It was a passion, and the fishing bug really hit me when I was probably about 15 or 16.
Okay, and then how did it become a living? Like, when did you start building rods professionally?
I travelled around Australia for 2 years after I left high school, and I came back home to Sydney wondering, what was I going to do, and lo and behold, there's an ad in the paper for a fishing rod builder.
Yeah.
Hard as it seems to believe, but there it was. Anyway, I applied for that and I got the job, and that was with a company called Hank Newman Sports. Hank Newman was a big name in sport fishing in the 70s and stuff. His son Dave was running the business, and we were doing what you call bulk production runs of rods for local distributors of Fenwick and Shakespeare and that sort of thing, and also learning a lot more about how it all worked and playing around with custom making my own stuff. So that's when it really kicked in. I learned a fair bit there from Mark Deeney and Dale Young were working there when I started, and I left there and went to work for Simo, Tim Simpson at Complete Angler in Sydney, and I'd been making some custom rods for Simo to sell. So I started working at the shop 3 days a week and making rods at home in my days off. Of course, that sort of opened my vision to all sorts of fishing with the sort of tackle that Simo was selling and dealing with, particularly game fishing, and the customers that he got, their requests were pretty varied. So I was filling those custom orders and also making rods to put on the rack.
Yep. And from there, where did it go?
Then I got headhunted by Chris Hall to go to Hardboard Tackle, which was, a young business on the rise, and as you know, they were a very progressive and aggressive business, and that was a big deal because I was actually in charge of an actual rod building department. So they gave me the resources I needed, pretty much whatever they were, within reason, and that's when things really started to escalate, and when I started to actually design my first rods, not just custom make to order or how we like them and modify things, but actually design. And I developed a relationship with Dick Snyder from Snyder Glass in Brisbane. And Dick was a bit of a legend in blank designing. Anyway, I gave him the exact measurement specs and everything of a blank I wanted made, and he built it for me and set up the patterns for it and that sort of thing, and that was my first short stroke blank.
Okay, yeah. And
that was the start of something pretty big because everyone was building on existing production blanks from Sabre and those sort of companies, and real Californian style, which is fine, but it wasn't how I wanted to build them and how I thought they should be for our fishing, especially our trolling and that sort of thing. And they were one-piece blanks. I wanted to make two-piece rods, and I didn't think they were structurally up to it. So, that was the start of it. And I think, in the end, Snyder Glass were doing over a dozen different unique designs for me. Right. And, I was selling game rods, stand-up and chair rods all around the world.
And from there, you ended up going out on your own and setting up Miller rods. When did Miller rods become an entity?
From there, I moved down here to the south coast. and set up my own workshop. And it was around that time when John Dunphy, our great friend, got us together in collaboration to make the Steve Starling signature range for Shimano, which was the whole start of our association with Shimano. But in the meantime, I started work down here in the workshop, and I was making a lot of rods for America at the time, game rods, as well as brim, bass, barra rods and that sort of thing. But I travelled to America to do a boat show or something with Tracy Melton. A blank manufacturer called Shikari had agreed to make blank graphite blanks for me, which was fairly significant because at that time there was nobody making graphite blanks for brim fishing in Australia. They didn't exist. Even bass blanks weren't really our bass. They were modified or adapted from something else, and barramundi the same. G. Loomis was becoming a player back then, but their blanks were still made for bass. It's just that we were using them for barra. And I was quite familiar with the G. Loomis product. I've been working with that for some years, from when it first was available, actually, before you could buy it in Australia. But when it was available in America, I was using those blanks to make some rods out of. So being able to get my own exclusive graphite blanks made by a really high-end American manufacturer was a big deal for me. And that subsequently allowed me to create the Brim Buster range, which were huge, and the bass rods, the Blade Masters, the Bass Busters, and then the barra rods, the Salty Barras, and it just opened up big time.
Look, speaking of Barra, I've got to ask you, the nickname Barra, I've always known you as Barra. You've been Barra ever since I met you. Where did that come from?
Well, that's an easy one. That's from the Hank Newman Sports days, from Mark Deeney.
Okay.
We all know Mark Deeney as Scruff.
Well, everyone had nicknames
in his circle of friends. You had to have a nickname.
That's right. You were Scruff. You were Booger. You were Simo.
That's right.
No one knew your real name.
That's right. So I remember a card game I played. I just got to tell you about this one. I think we were fishing the banks or it might have been fishing the banks in the Narrow Sport Fishing Comp or something like that. Way back when I just met the boys, as they called themselves, and we had a poker game. And I was sitting around the table, and there was just no one had a normal name. There was Scruff, there was Booger, there was Huge, there was Lash, and there was even a guy called Forestry Commission. He's a jeweller now. Forest makes nice jewellery. But I'd been travelling, as I said, surfing and fishing my way around Australia, and that was that job with Mark Deeney and Dave Newman, and that was my first job back when I came back. So I would carry on about barra fishing.
So you were talking about it.
I was talking about it all the time. So he started calling me Barra, and it stuck.
It stuck. It sure did. It's just amazing. Now you mentioned that you were, already in those days you were building quite a few rods for overseas customers, particularly for the States. And I know that along the way you've built some rods for some fairly famous anglers and people that are famous in other walks of life. What are some that spring to mind?
Well, I've built rods for a lot of high-profile people. A couple of different presidents.
US presidents, though, that's amazing. You built one for one of the Bushes, did you? George Jr.
And
was that like a commissioned job?
It was from the Prime Minister.
So it was a gift from Australia. That's really neat.
One that I do remember that I really enjoyed was making some rods for Casey Stoner. A very famous bike rider. And he got me to build a range of rods custom rods for all his fishing, but I also got to build him as a gift, which he didn't actually know about, that he, through his wife, a custom rod to celebrate his career. So I had to match the remember his Prepsol Honda, and it had bright colours. I had to match the rod with that, which was a bit of a challenge, but it was a fun challenge and beautiful rod. And he really loved it.
That's right. Now you've done quite a few trips to the States. I didn't realise you'd gone quite that early back in those days, and I know in the last few years you've been going nearly every year, haven't you, over to various shows and also doing quite a bit of fishing over there. How would you sum up the differences in tackle?
America has a real solid base in low-end tackle. And they can sell their rods and reels very, very cheaply. And it has created a bit of a sort of a throwaway kind of philosophy on it. But in recent years, they are more coming around to purchasing items of value in their fishing tackle collection and then hanging on to them.
What I found interesting, talking to Steve Morgan when he first went over there and actually competed as a co-angler in some of the bass comps and so on, he was surprised at that point there'd been very little take-up of braid, for example, and when they did take up braid, they tended to use it straight through to the lures and things like that. There was a real aversion to tying any more than one knot in a rig. And has that changed over time?
A little, but not much. Look, in some ways they're ahead of us. You've got to remember, like the bass fishery, which I've been really focused on for a few years now, they've been catching those fish since the early 1900s. So 100 years of lure fishing. So you can imagine how that's developed what they do. And they're actually well ahead of us in some areas because of that. But it's interesting with the braid and mono thing that you mentioned because they typically like their lines straight through and not with a leader. Now
you've been closely involved with Carl Jochimson, the young Aussie who's done such a great job, going over there and competing in bass tournaments, and that opened some doors for you, I guess, too. And now you've actually started selling rods into the US.
Yeah. As you know, we've been involved with supporting Carl since he was a teenager. Tim Morgan and his dad Pete actually recommended him to me one event, and we were all fishing together. And anyway, we started supplying him with rods and were with him his whole Australian career all the way to the top. And then when he made the leap into going to America, we stayed on board, and I actually just started trying to kit him out with the rods he would need, and in the end it just had to be a case of me going over and fishing so I could understand it and just shortcut all that and get into it. So that's what we did, and 7 years later, just still doing those trips. But I guess after a few years it became pretty apparent to me that I'd pushed what I was able to deliver him to my limits in terms of the resources I had at that time.
Yeah.
So I just knew that to take it to the level he was requiring and that I wanted to deliver would mean sort of escalating it to the point of going to blank engineers and just starting from scratch with every single model to make sure they were exactly how we wanted them to be. So sort of made that decision that's where it had to head, and that then in turn creates a need to be able to sell something, because you can't just enter into a program like that to satisfy the needs of one person.
No, that's right.
So then you have to start getting it, basically a mass production of those blanks to make it worthwhile.
Also, I guess people were looking at the stuff that Carl was using and going, wow, I wouldn't mind getting one of those.
That was the tipper, because getting blanks made is one thing, but then having to build the rods to maybe satisfy the demands that were already there, with people seeing what Carl was using and his co-anglers and whatever that he would fish with, using his rods and saying, where can I buy one of these rods? And you just couldn't. So anyway, we made the decision to launch into a full range of models, and I think we started off with 16 models, and they're pretty much all technique specific, which is another big thing. So we've been in the market for 18 months now, and just it's a long haul type thing. You just got to take it a step at a time.
Oh, good luck with it, mate. Yeah, it's a great project. Look, you've been building rods for a long time. What are the big things that have happened in rod technologies, blank wise, componentry wise, and design wise in your lifetime?
Without a doubt, blank materials. That's the real big one. Yep. When I first started making rods, it was mainly fiberglass. And Fenwick was just starting to do graphite and HMG and high modulus graphite, and Ugly Stick was the new kid on the block, and that was a pretty good sort of hybrid type blank that not only used fiberglass and graphite but also a new manufacturing technique. Graphite, on the other hand, just went through that period where it just went mad, and everything was being made out of graphite, and it was going ahead in giant strides every time, and pushed by people like Gary Loomis, I guess, who was, I think, the first one to get a graphite developed for fishing rods, not just borrowing from another industry,
which
is what we still do.
Yeah, what I remember most about those early graphite rods, apart from how light they were and how responsive, was how many we broke. Now, did they get better at building them, or did we get better at treating them with respect?
No, they got better at building them.
Oh, good.
Yeah. What we've been able to do these days, and you know, the rods that or the blanks I get made, and you know, the American rods, very good examples of it, using blends of graphite. So obviously modulus relates to tensile strength, or in other words, strength for weight. So the lighter and stronger, the higher modulus, and also the less robust. There's a couple of things you can do to counteract that, and they're on the blank manufacturing stage, and one is blending. So you're not overexposing that high modulus if you don't need to.
Yeah.
If you can get by with blending it with lower modulus graphite, that's what you do, because it enhances the strength.
All right, now what about on the component front? You know, the first rod I ever built had those metal guides on it, the Varmax.
Varmax, yeah.
Are they still around?
I don't know. I don't think so.
haven't seen one in a long time.
Maybe.
And then the big exciting thing was Fuji coming along and ceramics. So was that a major leap forward?
Yeah, and Fuji's still the player, in my opinion. They were always the company that pushed the envelope, looked to incorporate the latest materials, continually looking to develop product. Everyone else sort of moves along a little bit in their wake. And even today, they're still there developing. They've just developed a slim SIC ring. So after all these years, after they first developed SIC, which was quite a breakthrough in ceramic, now they've further refined it to be a slim ring to reduce the weight. So in their game, it's a lot about weight and reducing it.
Yeah, and of course friction reduction and corrosion resistance in the frames and all that kind of thing. And finally, the design of the rods themselves. I mean, I remember a lot of the stuff we used to spin off the rocks with, and that in the early days was quite parabolic in nature, and then it got really exciting when things like the Butterworths and Snyders, the multi-taper things came along.
Dick Snyder made,
and all of a sudden we had rods that only really folded away in the top third, and that had plenty of guts in the butt end. All of that stuff, how's that all played out?
For a long time it was, from my point of view, it was using what was accepted, what the market seemed to want, and going with the flow. But the longer I was in the game of designing, and it started with the short stroker blank, the more the penny would drop, and I would realise that it's something that should be driven by the technique. When I say it, I mean blank strength and action is something that should be driven by the technique. Right. So with casting rods, obviously with short strokers, it's about fighting the fish, and the best way to do that, given our techniques and fishing styles. But with casting and spinning rods, it's all about the lure and how to cast it best, how to retrieve it best, and then a little bit of how you fight the fish, which is still not how most people conceive the role of the blank. Most people still conceive the role of the blank as in it's what you use to fight the fish, and hence Australians have got this preoccupation of classifying blanks in terms of line strength, and I've always hated it because now with braids, I mean,
it makes no sense at all. People still talk about 2 to 4 kilo rods,
and
then they fish 15 or 20 pound braid over them, which break at double those amounts. So you've got 40 pound line through your 2 to 4 kilo rod. I would love to see that 2 to 4 kilo, 3 to 6 kilo thing disappear.
Well, that's it. We abolished the line.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, but first thing I look at with rod design is what it's going to be used for, what lure it's going to cast, and then I start considering what sort of length, action and strength the blank will need. Yeah. So basically you're talking more about technique-specific fishing rod, which is that's where I'm heading.
Well, look at this Murray cod stuff that you and I have gone a bit crazy on in the last couple of years, throwing big swim baits and big surface lures for Murray cod at places like Copeton Dam and a lot of the other dams. If you're really honest with yourself, you're going to spend 99.99% of your time casting and 0.01% of your time with a fish on the other end of the line.
Right.
So what should the rod be good at?
You should be good at delivering.
Yeah.
Leave your fish fighting preoccupation to a stand-up game rod or a chair rod, because that's what they're designed to do. They don't even start working until the fish is on. Whereas, as you're saying, with a casting or spinning rod, it is a delivery tool, and 99% of its work does happen without a fish on the other end, just you and the lure. So it's got to be all about that, and that's always been, my main drive, and it makes a difference to alter the blank action and strength. It makes a massive difference, and the length in the rod not only performing the task better, but also making it so much easier for the angler. The swim bait rods is a really good case point because it's totally different to anything we've ever done here in Australia before. I was lucky enough on one of those American trips to hook up with a big, what they call a big bait specialist, and I fished with him for a day and learned all about glide baits and swim baits, and I actually had a prototype which I'd made with the advice of Carl mainly, and also the advice of this fellow Oliver Nye, who's quite well known. Anyway, the prototype was really on the money. It was a great rod. We fished with it all day. He's still got that rod, actually, Oliver, and he showed me all about the ins and outs of using big swim baits and glide baits, and we didn't catch any monster bass that day. We had a couple of big follows. We didn't get any bites, but the whole day, all I could think of was Murray cod. They're just going to love this. This is going back about 3 years
and
ago.
Impoundment Barra, aren't going
and Impoundment Barra, that's all I could think of all day because, it was a long time ago. Most people hadn't even heard of a swim bait back then.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to ask you to gaze into the crystal ball now. Are there more, is there another graphite standard or ceramic guide standard breakthrough just around the corner? How will rods look in 5 or 10 years' time?
Well, if there was and I knew about it, I probably wouldn't be telling you.
No, that's fine.
But I don't think so.
No.
The advances these days are more incremental. We're looking at rods that are going to be lighter and more sensitive, probably stronger than they are now, and better balanced and just higher performance, which is, much the same as the improvements have been for the last 10 years or so.
All right, now I was going to ask you what floats your boat in terms of fishing these days, but I'm going to make it even more specific. If you only had one day left to go fishing, where would you go and what would you target?
That's too hard. That's the sort of situation you never want to be confronted with, but especially for someone like me that would, happily catch a fish in a puddle, if that's all that was there. Well, it'd probably be one of my favourites, and they all tend to be bee fish, like bass and barra and billfish and bream, that sort of thing. But it's too hard to choose. But look, topwater, sight casting, or at least, seeing the fish and getting a bite off the top. They'd have to include that.
Fair answer, mate. All right, well, cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for having a beer with me.
No worries.
Great.
Bring me a beer anytime.